Hey everyone, welcome back to my series on the 2020 Democratic Party platform. If you missed the first two videos on how the platform was drafted and on the preamble, you can find them in the description below. For the remainder of this series, I won't be reading the entire section out loud. That would get way too long. Instead, I've highlighted actual policies in green and things I want to make a note of in yellow. I will give a general summary of each of the main points and keep a running list of the policies over here. At the end of this video, I'll go over what policies are included, as well as any glaring omissions that I can see. So, to get started, this first entire page has no policies whatsoever, and basically just talks about how Donald Trump has mishandled the COVID-19 pandemic. And once again, the Democrats are basically just using this to frame how they are not Donald Trump, and in a lot of ways I do actually believe that they would have handled some aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic a lot better, but also I don't think that they would have done some things any better than the Republicans, such as actually giving money and like a monthly emergency UBI to the American people, as opposed to just bailing out corporations. I really have no faith that they would have actually done that any better than the Republicans, but they spend this whole first page just talking about how Trump has mismanaged the pandemic to set the stage for what they would/will do better. Moving on to the next page, we actually get some of our first policies. They start out with a commitment to make COVID-19 testing widely available, convenient, and free. They also are making a commitment to expand funding to local public health departments so that they can hire staff to do contact tracing. Both of these things are really good. In the next paragraph, they also talk about making treatment and an eventual vaccine free, which I really hope happens if Joe Biden and Kamala Harris win in November. I'm not holding out a ton of hope because we know how pharmaceutical companies can be and we know how they lobby people, but if they make good on this plan, that would be fantastic to make all of the treatment and vaccines and everything free to the public. In paragraph 9, they have to get in their obligatory pat on the back for the Affordable Care Act, which is less than the bare minimum of what we actually need to have good health care in this country, but I guess it's better than nothing. They will take action to preserve and expand health insurance coverage, and they would do that by increasing support to states to enroll people in Medicaid. They would have the federal government cover more of a percentage of the cost of enrolling people in Medicaid, and they would incentivize states to expand Medicaid, of which there are a shocking number of states who've not done that yet. Actually, Missouri literally just voted to expand Medicaid earlier this month. They also will expand access to health insurance by saying that the federal government will help people stay on their COBRA insurance, which helps people stay on their insurance that they get with their job. They promise to reopen the Affordable Care Act marketplaces, which are usually only open during a specific time of the year, so that more people can go buy health insurance if they haven't yet. And they'll expand subsidies so that people can buy health insurance. They also commit to making a public option available on this marketplace, which is literally the least they can do. The problem with all of this, though, is that this sentence right here says that all of this about expanding health insurance coverage is only in effect while the pandemic is going on and while there's high unemployment. Basically, they're saying that we'll do these things, we'll like get close to maybe a progressive vision of healthcare, but only while this crisis is going on. And the thing that they fail to understand is that the healthcare system in the United States was in crisis long before COVID-19 came around, and will be in crisis if we don't do anything, even when we have treatment and vaccines. Their next policy is basically ramping up production of PPE and essential medicine by working with private sector manufacturers, something we should have been doing already. And then distributing medical supplies according to need and not having states compete against each other for life-saving materials, which was honestly a really shit thing for the government to have done in the first place. This paragraph is really important. It talks about protections for people with disabilities, which I know has been a huge issue for people with disabilities getting substandard care, or worrying that if they did get the virus, they would get substandard care because of their disability. So it's really important that the platform actually has this in here and promises not to segregate patients with disabilities unjustly, or not prohibit rationing of healthcare to people with disabilities. They also make a promise to expand protections for people who are residents and staff of nursing homes, which have been a huge hotspot for the pandemic. And they also want to expand support for telemedicine, which is a really great thing and honestly part of the future direction of medicine in general. Further, they go on to talk about having a surveillance program for COVID-19, and hiring contact tracers, which again is something you really need to have if you want to be able to track and contain the disease, which right now we just cannot. They'll increase funding for the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, and for state and local health departments, which again will help as far as like containing the virus locally and being able to do contact tracing within a local population. They want to support research grants at HBCUs and minority serving institutions. This is really key because something that tends to get overlooked when we're talking about the virus as a whole is that it disproportionately impacts communities of color and other minoritized communities. So it's really key that when we're talking about how to research it, we talk about also giving funding to like Black researchers, researchers of color, people who work with those communities, because they are who are working with the people who have been primarily affected. They talk about reforming the unemployment insurance system, which has been an absolute mess during this pandemic. I've heard from friends who've had issues with it, stories on the internet. It's just been a disaster. So they want to allow more workers to remain attached to their jobs, basically so that they have a job to go back to, which is important for job security, etc. They want to expand the unemployment insurance system to cover more workers, including gig, part-time, and tip workers, and then making sure the platform companies for those workers actually pay into the system for unemployment insurance as opposed to like weaseling out of it like they do right now. And basically, the question that I have about this particular section is, does it also expand unemployment insurance to people who refuse to go back to unsafe employers? Because I've seen that a lot, that people are often caught between a rock and a hard place when their employer says it's time to reopen, and the employees know that the employer is not being safe and that going back to work will put them and their families at risk. Currently, if they turn down that offer to go back to their job, they don't get unemployment insurance. And so I'm wondering if this reform to the unemployment insurance would include a way for people who say, like, my job isn't being safe to get that insurance, or if they're still left out in the dust. And unfortunately, I expect it's the latter, but it doesn't clarify here. They want to expand wage replacement, or raise wage replacement rates, and expand nutrition assistance and food security programs. That is also huge. So I've been involved in St. Louis in a group called St. Louis Quarantine Support, getting people food during this pandemic, and that's been one of the major barriers, is that people's ability to literally pay for the food that they need to survive is even more difficult now than it was before. And for many, many people, it was extremely difficult before. So that's really frustrating, and hopefully this would help. They want to modernize unemployment system technology and strengthen oversight of unemployment systems. Moving on, they basically want to support public sector jobs, because those have been really hard hit by budget shortfalls, extending significant aid to state and local governments, school districts, and colleges and universities. And they want to condition that aid on maintaining public sector employment and protecting workers' rights. So that's all really good, basically continuing on their plan of like protecting jobs and maintaining jobs throughout the pandemic. Ensuring childcare, stabilizing the childcare sector, giving money to the childcare sector, and protecting workers in childcare. I mean, that's huge because people are at home during the pandemic and don't have access to the childcare they would, or they have to go back to work, but don't have access to childcare because maybe like childcare services aren't open or childcare services aren't being safe. So I think this is a really important point, and I wish they'd expanded upon it a little bit more. Okay, so here's where we get into a point I want to make that's going to come up throughout the whole platform. They use the word support a lot, they being like the platform committee and the DNC as a whole, when they want to make it look like they're on the right side of something. They want to make it look like they support something that's really common sense without actually committing to doing anything specific about it. So here they say that they support state and local measures to freeze rent increases, evictions, utility shutoffs, and late fees for rent, which doesn't commit them to doing anything. They say they support state and local measures, so they're basically saying the federal government is staying out of this. If state and local communities want to do these things, they can, but we're not going to do anything on a national level, which I think is a huge dereliction of duty. Like, the national government has the ability to provide the kinds of subsidies and the kinds of legislation that would be necessary to actually like institute a national rent freeze, which would keep people from A, losing their housing during a pandemic, or B, racking up rent bills that they can't pay over the course of the pandemic. And then, like, what is happening literally right now, all those bills are coming due and people don't have the thousands of dollars that they need to actually pay rent and stay in their living situation. So to me, it's really frustrating that they're like, oh, we support this, but they're not actually going to do anything to make it a reality. They just say, like, this should happen, but we're staying out of it. They do this again in the next paragraph when they're talking about small businesses. So they say that they support grants and loans to small businesses to help them make payroll, pay rent, and other expenses. So again, what they're saying is, we think this should happen, but we're not going to commit the federal government to doing anything about it. We're just gonna like cross our fingers and hope that Congress does it, I guess. Again, really frustrating. And then they say that they would prioritize this support for Black entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs of color, and women entrepreneurs, which, cool. But again, this is all under the context of them supporting this, but not committing themselves to doing anything. In the next paragraph, they say that they'll impose rigorous oversight on big corporations. I really wish that I believed that that were true, but I highly doubt it, given how even the Democrats, the mainstream Democrats, responded to the debates over the aid packages that were occurring earlier this year. They plan to protect paid sick leave, which is obviously really important, and protect essential workers while on the job. I think this just means like having better safety precautions, having more PPE, etc. This got a little bit confusing, but essentially here they're talking about access to internet, which is, as we're finding out, really, really important, and especially as we're thinking about like kids going back to school. A lot of times wealthier communities are able to have more schooling from home because their students have more access to the internet and the kinds of internet connections that will allow them to have a consistent connection for a class over Zoom, for example, whereas poorer communities don't necessarily have that. And so students have to go into the classroom physically in order to receive their education, which is only one of the many problems that there are with the whole school reopening thing. So basically here, they want to prevent states from blocking municipalities and rural co-ops from building publicly owned broadband networks. So basically, municipalities and rural co-ops are building these networks. Some states are trying to stop this from happening, and the Democratic Party wants to stop the states from stopping that from happening, which ultimately means more broadband for more people, so good. Increase federal support for municipal broadband, good. Require that funding recipients adhere to union protections and other protections that support good jobs. increased investment in broadband infrastructure, increased subsidies for low-income Americans to access the internet, investment in digital literacy. All these are really great things as far as people having access to the ways that modern communication, the modern economy operates. Restoring the FCC's ability to enforce, to take enforcement action against broadband providers who violate net neutrality principles. So I don't know if this means they're going to like reinstitute net neutrality, or if they're just going to reenact harsher punishments. My hope is that this is actually them saying that we're going to go back to when we had full enforcement for net neutrality, hopefully. And then just here I wanted to highlight, they talk about basically how Obama and other like Democratic presidents have responded to previous public health crises. And this conveniently leaves out the complete mismanagement of the AIDS crisis back in the 80s and 90s. And they just completely, they like don't want to talk about it because they're like, we did so great with Ebola, guys. We like really prevented a horrible thing from happening there. Let's not talk about AIDS because everybody dropped the ball on AIDS. Yeah, really frustrating. So that's basically the end of the segment on COVID-19. One last thing that I wanted to point out, this is the glaring omissions bit, is that they say absolutely nothing about protections or support or how any of this impacts people who are unhoused and people who are in prison. That is just like, those are two of the biggest populations hit by the pandemic, and it is unfathomable to me that they spent all this time talking about a lot of actually really good policies to mitigate the effects of the pandemic on workers and on like people in nursing homes and on minority communities and all of these different things, and they completely leave out two of the most vulnerable communities because honestly most of society just wants those people to stay invisible. And the thing is that they're not, and they're suffering. And we really need to have policies that help people who are incarcerated and people who are unhoused. I mean, we just do. We just need that. And the Democrats really dropped the ball on that one. You can look in this document down below to see a recap of the policies that were in this section. And I will catch you in the next video on building a stronger and fairer economy. Have a great day. Bye.